Let's talk about belief, not just political belief or religious belief or ideological belief, but the kind of belief that shapes identity, legacy, and survival. Because when we talk about Israel and Iran, what we're really talking about is a deep-rooted war of beliefs that has spanned generations. And here's the truth: beliefs are powerful. They determine how people behave, how they lead, and ultimately how nations collide. See, we don't act based on what's real. We act based on what we believe is real. That's why two people, or two entire nations, can look at the exact same situation and walk away with completely opposite conclusions. For Israel, the foundation of belief is survival. It's protection. It's the idea that the world will never again be allowed to turn its back on Jewish suffering. The trauma of the Holocaust didn't just scar a people. It wired a nation to believe that the cost of passivity is extinction. So every decision, every military operation, every policy stance, it's all filtered through that lens. We must survive. We must never be vulnerable again. That belief system has built one of the most powerful security infrastructures in the world, but it's also made diplomacy feel like a gamble with existence. Now, look at Iran. This isn't just about politics. It's spiritual, historical, cultural. Iran's belief system is built on resistance, on standing up against oppression, foreign domination, and what it sees as injustice, especially in the form of Western imperialism and Zionism. Iran's leadership has infused generations with the belief that they are fighting a righteous cause. That opposing Israel isn't just a political stand, it's a sacred duty. It's David vs. Goliath flipped. And if you believe that you are the chosen agent of resistance, then compromise doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like betrayal. This is why negotiations stall. This is why peace talks crumble. Because you're not just dealing with policies, you're dealing with deeply emotional, identity-driven belief systems. And those don't get rewritten with press releases or treaties. They get rewritten when people are willing to challenge the stories they've been told, and the stories they keep telling themselves. Let me ask you something. Have you ever held on to a belief so strongly that it defined you? That even when new information came in, even when your heart told you something else, you still couldn't let go? That's what's happening on both sides. Israel believes it must always be prepared for the worst. Iran believes it must always defy the world that tries to silence it. Both sides feel cornered, and when you feel cornered, you don't reach for peace. You reach for defense. You reach for aggression. You strike before you can be struck. But here's the opportunity, and this is where transformation begins. If belief is the foundation, then change has to begin there. The real question isn't who's right or who started it. That gets us nowhere. The question is, are we willing to look at the belief systems that got us here and ask if they are still serving us? Because beliefs are not facts, they are frameworks, and frameworks can evolve. That's the only way we've ever moved forward individually, as a people, as humanity. We challenge old beliefs. We expand our vision. We realize that survival doesn't always mean domination, and resistance doesn't always mean destruction. Think about this: the same emotional energy that fuels war, fear, pride, vengeance, can be redirected. That same power can fuel cooperation, innovation, and peace. But only if we're courageous enough to reframe the beliefs that got us into conflict in the first place. And that's not weak, that's leadership. We cannot keep waiting for the other side to change their belief first. Someone has to go first. Someone has to break the pattern, because if both sides keep waiting, nothing changes. Cycles repeat, generations bleed, and belief becomes a prison instead of a platform. So what would happen if leaders on both sides paused not to surrender, but to reconsider what they believe about each other, about themselves, about the possibilities ahead? What if belief could be less about what we're afraid to lose and more about what we dare to build? Belief is the beginning of every conflict, but it's also the beginning of every break. Let's take a step back and look at something most people never talk about when it comes to international conflict. We spend all our time talking about weapons, strategies, sanctions, borders, but we forget something far more powerful: emotion. Human emotion is the driver behind every decision a leader makes. Behind every missile launch, every political speech, every alliance, every breakdown in negotiations, there's a human being with fear, anger, pride, resentment, hope. Emotions are not just side effects of politics, they are politics. Think about it. Leaders are people. They're not machines crunching data. They carry their own personal stories, childhoods, traumas, beliefs, pressures. And those stories leak into how they lead nations. Now zoom that out. Multiply that emotional energy across a cabinet, a military, a nation, and now you're talking about emotional patterns on a massive scale. This is what drives the dynamic between Israel and Iran. It's not just geopolitics, it's emotional patterns clashing with each other in a loop that has repeated itself for decades. Israel's emotional pattern is shaped by one core wound: we will never be vulnerable again. That wound runs deep. You can trace it all the way back through centuries of persecution, pogroms, the Holocaust. It's not just a policy, it's a visceral feeling passed down generationally, a feeling that survival depends on absolute readiness, that if you aren't 2 steps ahead, you're already at risk. So what happens emotionally? A constant state of alert, hypervigilance. Strength becomes a survival mechanism. And that emotion doesn't just shape military decisions. It shapes how Israel sees the world, through the lens of "we can't afford to trust." That mindset creates isolation even when there's strength. It creates suspicion even when there's opportunity. And it creates a kind of hardened exterior that doesn't always allow space for new possibilities. Now look at Iran. Iran's emotional pattern is completely different, but just as powerful. It's shaped by humiliation, colonial manipulation. The 1953 coup, sanctions, cultural suppression. Iran sees itself as a great civilization that's been disrespected, underestimated, and controlled by outside forces. That breeds a different emotional pattern. We will not be told what to do. It creates defiance, nationalistic pride, a fierce need to assert power, not just to gain something, but to reclaim something that feels stolen. And here's the emotional core of that. When people feel unheard or dishonored, they don't de-escalate. They double down, they raise their voice, they flex, not because they're evil, but because they're emotionally wired to resist. So when you put these 2 emotional patterns in the same space, one side saying, "we must protect ourselves at all costs," and the other saying, "we will not be controlled by anyone," you've already got a recipe for collision. It's not even about who's right or wrong. It's about emotional wiring that makes connection almost impossible unless someone interrupts the pattern. And here's the key: nobody ever breaks a pattern by force. You don't de-escalate emotion with more emotion. You don't break through fear with more threats. You do it by meeting the emotion where it is. You've got to understand it. You've got to be willing to ask, what's underneath this reaction? What are they really trying to protect? What are they really afraid of? Most negotiations fail because we're not speaking to the emotion. We're speaking to the logic. But logic never wins when emotion is running the show. If you've ever been in a relationship, you know this is true. You can be 100% right and still lose because you didn't speak to the heart. You didn't connect to what was really going on. And if that's true in a relationship between 2 people, how much more true is it between 2 nations that have decades of pain buried in their interactions? We've seen it over and over. Peace talks start, there's momentum, and then suddenly it all unravels. Why? Because someone got triggered, someone reverted to the old pattern, someone's emotional need to be respected, to feel secure, to feel powerful wasn't met. And once that pattern gets activated, the progress vanishes like smoke. The only way to change this is to lead differently. It takes leaders who understand their own emotional patterns, leaders who don't just react but respond, leaders who don't just defend their position but understand the other side's pain. That doesn't mean you agree with your enemy, but it means you stop treating them like a cartoon villain and start recognizing them as human. Because if we stay locked in the story that the other side is evil, irrational, inhuman, we'll never make progress. Ever? That's the story that fuels every war in history. But if we're willing to look at the emotion underneath the aggression, the insecurity behind the threats, the pain behind the pride, then we have a shot. A real shot, not just at temporary ceasefires, but at long-term change. But someone has to go first. Someone has to rise above the trigger, above the emotion, above the fear, and choose a new path, because power isn't about domination. Real power is the ability to shift your emotional state so you can shift the state of the world around you. When you look at a conflict like Israel versus Iran, most people only see the surface. They see the headlines, the missiles, the threats, the sanctions. But if you want to understand what's really happening, you've got to go deeper than the events. You've got to look at the stories underneath those events. Because human beings don't just act based on facts. We act based on the stories we tell ourselves about those facts. And when those stories get locked in, they become identities. They become unshakable realities that feel more solid than the ground we're standing on. Israel has a story. Iran has a story. And those stories don't just exist independently. They clash. They feed the conflict. They fuel the fear. And they keep both sides stuck in the same old pattern. But here's the thing. Stories are powerful, but they're not permanent. And when we start to recognize the story instead of blindly reacting to it, that's when we get power back. That's when we gain the ability to create change. Let's start with Israel. The Israeli story is built on survival. It's the story of a people scattered, persecuted, nearly erased, who rose from the ashes and said, "Never again." That's not just a slogan. That's a story wired deep into the emotional DNA of the nation. Everything Israel does is filtered through that lens. The lens of being surrounded, outnumbered, misunderstood, and therefore constantly needing to be prepared, armed, ready. It's not just a military stance, it's an emotional one, and when you believe the world will never truly protect you, you stop asking for help. You stop waiting for understanding. You become your own shield. That story is what gives Israel strength. But it's also what makes real trust feel impossible. Now, look at Iran's story. Iran doesn't see itself as the aggressor. It sees itself as the last line of resistance. It sees itself as the proud, ancient civilization that's been pushed, manipulated, isolated, undermined by outsiders. The Persian identity runs deep, and with it comes a powerful sense of destiny. Iran believes it's been chosen not to bend, not to bow, but to stand firm. And that story, just like Israel's, isn't about politics. It's about honor. Iran doesn't see itself as threatening anyone. It sees itself as threatened. It sees its defiance as righteous, as just, as necessary. And so every time the West criticizes Iran, every time Israel tightens its stance, that just confirms the story Iran already believes. They'll never see us as legitimate. They'll never respect us unless we force them to. Now think about what happens when these two stories meet. You've got one side saying we can never lower our guard, and the other saying we must never submit. That's not just disagreement, that's narrative warfare. Each action taken by one side reinforces the other side's story. Israel launches a strike. Iran says, "See, we're under attack." Iran makes a provocative statement. Israel says, "See, we can't trust them." And round it goes. Each side feels justified. Each side feels righteous. Each side feels like the victim. This is why progress is so rare. Because no one is really challenging the story. Everyone's just reacting inside of it. You can have meetings, treaties, photo ops, but if the story underneath doesn't shift, nothing really changes. It's like trying to fix a cracked screen by changing the wallpaper. The surface might look different, but the underlying break is still there. And this isn't just about governments. This is about the people. The citizens on both sides are being fed these stories day after day. News, schoolbooks, propaganda, cultural memory, it all builds the narrative. And when that becomes your truth, it's hard to even imagine the other side having their own truth. You stop seeing them as human, you start seeing them as symbols, and when that happens, empathy disappears. And when empathy disappears, peace becomes impossible. So what do? We challenge the story, we interrupt the pattern. We ask better questions. What if the story you've been told your entire life isn't the whole picture? What if the enemy you fear is acting out of fear, too? What if both sides are trapped in a story that no longer serves them? Let me tell you something powerful. The moment you realize you're the author, the moment you understand that stories are chosen, not imposed, you reclaim power. That's how transformation happens. You don't wait for the other side to rewrite their narrative. You start by rewriting yours. Because when one side shows up differently, the whole pattern changes. That's not weakness, that's leadership. Israel doesn't have to stop defending itself. Iran doesn't have to give up its dignity, but both sides have to ask, what story are we clinging to that's keeping us locked in war? What's the price of holding onto that narrative? And who could we become if we chose a different one? Because we're not just fighting over land. We're not just fighting over politics. We're fighting over stories. And the moment one side decides to rewrite the ending, the conflict begins to dissolve. There's something we need to face when it comes to conflict, especially on a scale as deep and complex as Israel and Iran. Pain doesn't just break us, it shapes us. It carves patterns into the minds of people and nations. And if we're not careful, we start believing that conflict is just the way it is, that it's inevitable, that war, hate, mistrust, fear, those are just the price of survival. But what if that's not true? What if the pain we've experienced isn't just here to punish us, but to push us towards something greater? Every nation, like every person, reaches a moment where it has to decide. Do we stay in the pain, keep repeating the cycle, keep telling the same story, or do we use the pain to create something entirely new? That's the moment of power. That's the moment of transformation. But it only happens if we're willing to face the hard truth. Pain is not our enemy. It's our teacher. Look at history. Look at how many of humanity's greatest breakthroughs came out of the darkest times. The civil rights movement came out of generations of injustice. The end of apartheid came from unimaginable struggle. Peace agreements, however fragile, came in places like Northern Ireland, not because things were easy, but because people finally got tired of bleeding. They got tired of hate. They got tired of handing the same pain down to their children. And when the pain of staying the same finally became greater than the pain of change, change happened. This is where Israel and Iran stand right now. This is the moment. The moment where both sides have to decide whether they're going to stay in the loop of fear, aggression, mistrust, or whether they're ready to rise. I'm not talking about weakness. I'm talking about real strength, the kind of strength that doesn't come from rockets or rhetoric, the kind that comes from vision. Because let's be honest, both countries have already proven they can fight. Israel has one of the most advanced militaries on the planet. Iran has built regional influence through strategy, alliances, ideology. They've both played the game of power, but here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Just because you can win a fight doesn't mean you should keep fighting it. Because the cost is no longer just soldiers or territory. It's generations of children growing up knowing only fear. It's opportunities lost, lives unlived, dreams traded for survival. At some point, the true measure of power isn't how much damage you can do. It's how much future you can create. That's what leadership is. It's the courage to say, we've carried this burden long enough. It's time to build something new. But let's be real. This isn't about some fantasy where everybody suddenly gets along and holds hands. This is about doing the hard work of breaking a pattern, of stepping into the unknown, of being the one who says, it ends with me. That's not weakness. That's legacy. That's the kind of leadership the world remembers. You think people remembered the leaders who played it safe, who stuck to the old script, who doubled down on conflict just because that's what had always been done. No, we remember the ones who changed the story, who had the guts to imagine a different future and act on it. That's the real battlefield now, not land, not resources, but vision. Who can hold a vision bigger than revenge, bigger than resentment, bigger than the past, because that's where transformation lives. In that space where you're no longer just reacting to what's been done to you, you're creating what comes next. And the truth is, both Israel and Iran are sitting on massive untapped potential, economic, cultural, technological, strategic. The future is there. It's right in front of them. But they can't build it with hands that are still clenched into fists. And yes, the risks are real. There's always a cost to being the first to lower your guard, but there's a bigger cost to never doing it at all. Because if both sides wait for the other to change first, nothing changes. If both sides say we'll move when they do, the cycle continues. And the future stays hostage to the past. But imagine what happens if just one side chooses to interrupt the pattern. Just one side says, we're going to lead from the future, not from the past. That's the moment when everything shifts. Because transformation doesn't need permission, it needs courage. Just one moment of bold, clear, grounded leadership can crack open the door. And once it's open, the world can rush in. You want real power, real influence, real peace. You don't get it by clinging to what's familiar. You get it by being the one willing to go where no one else has gone. That's where history is made. That's where leaders rise. That's where nations don't just survive, they awaken. Because the greatest power is not in continuing a war. It's in ending one.